Okay, this is something that affects me till this day. I was 19 years old at the time. I had a very bad acid trip that seemed to possess supernatural powers, something very, very evil, I might add. This happened 8 years ago and I remember it like it was a few weeks ago. One day, after a morning of smoking rock cocaine and taking Adipex, what a nasty combination. A friend calls me up and tell me that he had some really potent acid for sale. I was a big-time acid fiend and I was used to doing heavy-duty tripping. Anyway, I told him to hold me 3 hits and I would be by later to pick it up. I didn't go over to get the acid until I was somewhat over the horrible feeling when you run out of coke or rock. I was still speeding. If you call Adipex speed, I call it trash, from the Adipex. I think I ate 2 Adipexes that day. Okay, anyway, that afternoon around 5 p.m. I got the acid and I remember how excited I was to take it because it had an elephant on the hit. It was more red than pink, but it was referred to as pink elephant. The hits were still moist, saturated with LSD. I remember wondering if he might have licked my stuff, but I knew he wasn't a acid head. So I thought I would be a badass and take all 3 hits, even though he told me I wouldn't need more than 1. Well, I took 3 hits under my tongue. They were still joined together as stamps, and I kept them under my tongue for a long time before grinding them up and dissolving it in my mouth. The acid came on slow at first. The first hour I felt the typical acid come on buzz. It wasn't until 3 hours after taking 3 hits of this stuff that things started to get really intense and almost scary. All I know is I ended up at a friend's, a female, who lived close by my house. I was still doing the driving at this point. Well, while I was over there at her house, we were on her screen porch and she has a couple birds that were in a cage. There was a picture on the wall of an angel and she appeared to be flying directly at me and I was commenting to the girl about it and laughing my ass off. Things started to get really freaky. It was almost the 3-hour mark and I remember being so freaked out by the birds and the noises they made that I was ready to leave. I felt an overwhelming rush and my skin looked as though I had millions of intense patterns on it. Before I left, this is what caused me also to leave. Her mom came and said hello and I thought I was still talking to the girl I was visiting, so there I was telling her mom that I was seeing the angel flying all over the room. The girl had to tell her mom I was tripping. Her mom was cool. Anyway, I left and drove about 2 blocks to another friend's house and he wasn't doing anything that night. He also had stopped doing acid. So I asked him if he would drive for me because I was really starting to trip. He agreed to go with me, so off we went to a bar. I said I wanted to go to play pool, of all things to do tripping. Well, we get to this old biker bar and there was a big party going on and hundreds of people, but we managed to get the only table there was. Well, that is when the acid started to tell me that this was not an ordinary trip. I started to hear noises. The bar started shaking, a little at first, then it got violent. As it was shaking, I could also hear bottles being hit together as if there was an earthquake and the bottles we hitting against each other. It still wasn't scared. I just felt really funny because not only was the bar and all shaking, but it felt like the bottom half of my body was shaking. It felt so strange. I asked my friend to leave with me and go outside. When we got outside it got worse, so I asked him to drive me to a store to get a beer, even though we were at a bar. So he drives me toward a store and it was like I could hear chanting. I asked him if he was saying stuff or chanting and he would tell me he wasn't, but I really thought he was trying to make me trip harder by messing with me. On the way to the store I would look through the passenger's side window and I got the fright of my life when I did. I seen the most evil-looking demonic figure when I would look out the window. It scared me really bad. That was just the beginning of what happened. This thing was so scary to look at that when I would look at it and make eye contact with it, it would actually make me go into convulsions. I lost all control of my body when this would make eye contact with me. Then it got to where when I would try to look away it would follow. And if I waited too long to move away again, it would catch up with me again and do the same thing. I also have to point out that this was not the only way I went into convulsions. Either by eye contact or it would just jump into my stomach and I would also convulse. So I was really freaking out. At this point we were supposed to be on our way to get a beer. I was just trying to get off that bad trip that was coming on at the bar, but I grew into something I will never ever forget. I made my friend turn around because of the demonic figures were about to give me a heart attack. I was so scared of this sight. On the way back home, right after he turned around, I imagined that we had drove head-on into an 18-wheeler and got killed. I could hear the screeching metal. Then everything got quite a peaceful, but dark and evil quiet. I was terrified at this point. I actually thought we were dead. It was like I was outside of my body looking at us from a different perspective. I thought we were doomed to hell for sure. This really was just the beginning of the bad trip. So now not only am I dealing with demonic figures, but now I have just visioned us being killed. The demons temporarily disappeared while I was hallucinating about the 18 and us getting in a fatal accident. But later the demons came back. Right after the wreck I imagined I grabbed my friend and I had one hand around his shoulder hugging him as tight as I could, like a little scared kid or something. I was terrified. The reason I grabbed my friend and hugged him is because I thought we had just been killed and I didn't want to lose him or let him go and I wanted him to tell me this wasn't real. When I grabbed him and hugged him he was driving. Luckily we were on a back country road going very slow at my request. 5 miles per hour seemed like 90 miles per hour. Anyway, when I hugged my friend my other hand I was moving it and asking if he could see my hand move. I kept asking him if I was alive and if we had been killed. I asked him about the wreck and he was like, "What wreck?" At this point I still think he is messing with me and I am begging him to please help me and not mess with me. He was actually so scared for me that he was crying. He brought me to my house and stayed with me the whole night. This isn't the end. Okay, so when we got home I thought that maybe if I got out and got fresh air I would be okay. Not a chance. The demonic figures reappeared and this time more scary than before. This time I remember claws on this creature. I kept thinking I would be dragged away. This trip was so intense that there is so much that happened that I will not remember to include in this writing. Well, 3 months before this bad trip I was in treatment and my mom bought me this book on near-death experiences and one of the stories in that book came into play on this bad acid trip. My life seemed to match someone who had a near-death experience and I thought I had to die because the person in that book lived and that we could not both survive the same experience. Well, I couldn't take it outside my house so we went inside and I went into the bathroom while my friend tried to keep my parents from noticing me. He seemed to be gone forever as I was in the bathroom looking in the mirror. Worst mistake. All I seen when I looked in the mirror was a horribly drug-ravaged corpse. Like it was me but I was transparent. Like some kind of spirit of evil, decent, very evil. It scared me so bad that when my friend came into the bathroom I was shaking like a leaf and I asked my friend to feel my heart beating and it scared him so much he went tell my dad what I was on and about my heart. As all this was happening I thought I was either already dead from the 18-wheeler crash or I was going to die, that I was going to be pulled away by this being. Well, the acid by this time was almost at peak level. Well, my dad comes in and feels my heart rate and decided to call 911. I was in the living room trying to avoid the demonic figures who kept appearing, still jumping into my stomach and giving me the eye. I also seen the same thing I seen in the mirror, the horrible ghost-like double of me. This also made me convulse. I never had anything like that happen to me and I used to do so much shrooms and acid. What I still think is it all built up because after that I always had a bad trip for a few years after. Well, the ambulance finally got there and I remember right before the ambulance got there the police got there too. They were asking me where I got the acid but the cops were the last thing on my mind. Okay, one of the first cops that wailed in looked like this friend of mine's dad who was a small-time cop in a small town. The cop looked exactly like that man and I thought I was dead at this point and that cop's spirit was there or something, like I was in some very scary afterlife. When the ambulance showed up they put me in the stretcher and in the back of the ambulance. When I got to the hospital I swore I flew in a helicopter. The ambulance drive I remember part of that. They would try to make me repeat stuff to see how my brain was reacting. I was also talking to God begging him to let me live and I was praying I wasn't already dead but I was convinced I was. I guess they wanted me to pee or something but I thought they were draining all the fluids out of my body because I was dead. The fours made me think the same thing. That they were preparing me to embalm. Later at the hospital I could hear them talking about funeral arrangements and everyone I seen looked like family members who had flew in from all over the US to see me one last time. I could smell the embalming fluid and I foreseen my funeral and I imagined how everyone would react. While I was recovering, even though I didn't know I was yet, I would see people who had been dead. They would walk in and this would further confirm I must be dead. It was not until the doc asked me if I wanted to see my mom that I started to get my head. Then my mom came in. I still thought I was dead, and she was rubbing my forehead and saying to me, "Now you see what drugs can do." Though she was saying that to her son's corpse. At that time I said, "Moma, can you hear me?" And then she said yes. That was the most beautiful yes I ever hear because at that moment reality started to come back to me. The whole time before all the doctors and nurses seemed to not be talking or communicating with me. It was not till I asked my mom if she could hear me that I realized I was indeed still here on earth and not awaiting hell and a funeral. Listen people, I have left out things I would have definitely wanted to include. This trip was so intense, so detailed, so supernatural that to this day I think that something very supernatural occurred. I was very lucky not to die. The doc said the lad wouldn't have killed me, but I could have died of fright. Well, after this experience I still kinda thought I might really be dead, and for about a year I wouldn't go into any cemetery because I was terrified I would find my own grave, and that is when I thought I would have to finish with the death part of the trip. This permanently damaged my brain people. I couldn't accept what had happened to me, so I decided to do acid again about 3 months after this bad trip, and do you know what kinda acid I done? Pink elephant. And I done a half a hit more than what put me in the hospital, and although I tripped killer I didn't have that bad trip, but after that I started to have bad trips again. Nothing like the pink elephant experience. However, I had a mushroom bad trip a couple years later and it was almost as bad. Well, I hope everyone uses LSD with more caution than I did. Don't mix drugs, especially coke, speed and acid. Peace and love to everyone, and remember, if you find yourself on a bad trip, just remember you aren't going to die and that many others have been through more intense trips than you have. There will always be someone who does more than the next person. Just be careful.